Okay, so today we're gonna start talking about detoxification, and part of the reason that I wanted to go through this with you, other than just some of you had brought this up and said, hey, let's talk about this. This is out there, is that there's really a lot of confusion around this term right now, and you'll see that as I go through the presentation how that term is being better defined in the literature at this time. So we want to kind of see where the literature is evolving right now, but I think this term, when you look at it, depending on who you ask about it, it really has a totally different meaning. If you ask someone who's maybe more complementary trained, we're like, oh yeah, detoxification. We don't really know what we're recommending sometimes, or we didn't when we were starting out. We were like, yeah, you guys should detox. And then if you talk to, more of the traditional folks from traditional medicine, detox is probably associated more along the lines of like drug or alcohol type programs, things like that. But there's a lot of area, and it's really validated in the literature, that fills in a lot of gaps in between those two areas. So those are kind of the two extremes. So what I want to do is try to really define what this is for you. And the other reason I want to talk to you about this is because if you just listen to the ads on the radio, there is so much misinformation out there. But I guess I should have thrown a third category in there instead of the lay public. If you ask the lay public what detoxification is, their idea of it is I'm going to be in the bathroom all day, right? So we wanted to dispel that myth as well. So let's look at the things we're going to talk about. First, we want to really define why detoxification is important. We want to kind of put that out there so that when we're talking and interacting with our patients, we have some background to explain to them why we need to be focusing on this. We want to look at some of the sources of toxins. Is there a physiological role for detoxification? We'll really get into outlaying that. How to support detoxification with nutrition and diet. Obviously, we want to come at this from a more complementary approach where we're actually supporting the systems that need to support. And then we'll look at some of the endogenous influences on detoxification. So things that are going to affect detox completely outside of the detoxification systems, although they're integrated. These next two slides are probably a little bit obvious. But I have to say it in going through this topic. So why do we need to be talking about detoxification? Well, the environment is getting more and more toxic. If you guys just go jump on an EPA website or Environmental Working Group website and just kind of flip through just a couple of pages on their sites, you'll find out we live in a pretty toxic environment. And actually, I'm going to show you the degree to which that toxicity is increasing and how it's playing into effects on the immune system. And just kind of think about this because, if you're looking at it from a clinical perspective, nobody ever really says, well, I'm detoxing to support my immune system, right? But you really should be. There's a strong connection there. Our patients are toxic and don't even realize it, and I'll show you how to extrapolate that information. The effects of toxins are systemic, so generally it's, we tend to isolate things, well, it's just your liver. That's kind of the big area. Your liver is the cleansing organ in the body, so your liver must be toxic. But it really goes far beyond just looking at the liver or even just a liver in the gastrointestinal tract. And then what is the disruption of these physiological systems? Because there's a lot of kind of secondary effects that come along from these toxins being located in the body. So here's some of your exogenous sources. These first few are, you guys know about these, the herbicides, the pesticides, the heavy metals. Those first three, even if you're telling someone, hey, eat a good clean diet, eat a paleo diet or a modified Mediterranean diet, those things are going to be in there. Even for, I can't say this 100%, but there is some confusion now about, well, what really is organic and how close is this organic farm to that organic farm and how much pesticide residue is landing on the secondary farm over here. So, even in a 100% organic environment, are you really avoiding all these toxins? Probably not. And then you've got your industrial byproducts, which in this area, of course, we have tons of, right? We've got the chemical plants close to us. But do we really even have to be in close proximity to a highly industrial environment to be exposed to these? And the answer to that is no, you don't. If you look at this, and I'll give you a good example on these phthalates. These phthalates are going to be found in your plastic. So this is actually what they incorporate into plastic when they're making that structure to help it be more moldable, more formable, right? And then these polychlorinated biphenyls, if you ever see something that says PCBs, this is what they're talking about. These PCBs are something that was basically taken out of industrial manufacturing probably 20 plus years ago. and there's still so much residue from 20 plus years ago that is still a toxic problem in the environment. So that kind of, that kind of says to you how these things don't really degrade, they just generally hang around. I wanted to give you a specific example on this. Most of you in here are familiar with looking at this steroid pathway, but what I want to point out to you is if you look at this P450, and how many of you guys are familiar with hearing about P450 enzymes? P450 enzymes, I'll show you some specific examples where that's involved with phase 1 detoxification, but P450 enzymes are a big class of enzymes. But we know that to get into this steroid hormone pathway, you've got to start with cholesterol. And to get from cholesterol to this pregnenolone, let me blow this section up for you. To get from that cholesterol to pregnenolone, you've got to go through this side chain cleavage enzyme. Now, here's what happens with these phthalates. Those phthalates start interacting on that side chain cleavage enzyme, and they basically knock it out. How many of you guys are doing hormone testing, salivary hormone testing, and then at the same time doing lipid testing? Right? How many times do you see an elevation in lipids, and then you get into doing the hormone assessment, and you'll really see this in saliva, and you see either a low pregnenolone or a low progesterone, right? It's pretty common out there. I see a lot of it. So this is potentially one of the mechanisms that you could be looking at. So now that's a key thought when I'm looking at this endocrine profile, if you're seeing that they've got low systemic hormones, because if you can't get into pregnenolone, that pregnenolone is your mother hormone. Where are you going to go from that? You got nothing to pull from to make any of the rest of these systemic hormones or these steroid hormones. So if you see a low systemic pattern, this is one of the things, detoxification is one of the things you want to begin to think about here. So let's look at a study to just kind of back this up and validate it for us. 2 endocrine disrupting chemicals in particular, offering useful and intriguing examples here. And look at the 2 that it points out. There's the 2 that I listed in the previous slide, your phthalates and your biphenols A's. But really what this is saying is that those 2 chemicals are going to be involved in disruption of your endocrine system, and it's because of these anti-androgen and estrogenic-like effects. So, if you think about it, probably the best example that comes right to mind for me is if you walk into a grocery store, and it doesn't really matter which grocery store, just pick your favorite. If you walk in, especially in the summer, how many cases of water in plastic bottles do they have sitting out front, right? You know that water's getting hot. You know that plastic's leaching into that water. So what's the potential for exposure to these phthalates? It's pretty high, right? So this is a real effect here. And actually, if you'll look at this, just kind of scan back through this, some of the complications, brain sexual differentiation, I mean, that's kind of significant. That's a pretty profound effect there. And here's another one. This is going into a little bit more detail further down into that steroid pathway where you're getting over here into your androgens and your estrogen. So notice what this says. This is actually specifically talking about the effects of phthalates on this 3-beta-hydroxysteroid and the 17-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So basically the enzymes that are going to allow for conversion in between these different hormones, your phthalates have the propensity to knock out and inhibit the function of those enzymes that make those conversions for you. Again, that's, real recent documented information here. And it's not just in one generation, so you can cross generations here. So associations between maternal phthalate exposure and cord sex hormones. So more or less what this is saying is that the maternal exposure of phthalates affects sex steroid hormone status in the infants and the newborns here. So it's crossing over. All right, so that's your exogenous. That's just kind of some exogenous examples there. So now let's talk about more endogenous effects here. And really when I think about this, if you can simplify something, simplify it. Don't complicate things, right? So let's just simplify this down to as much as we can. You really have 5 detoxification organs here. You've got the skin. Obvious excretion method there is going to be through your sweat, so you're excreting stuff out. Your kidneys, obviously urine is going to be your method of excretion there. That's why we can look at when we do, and I'll give you an example of this later on, but when you look at, say, like heavy metal testing, that's the reason you can check for those heavy metals in the urine, because it's going to be excreted out through the kidneys. Your liver, your bile, and urea there. We know if you're not taking your ammonia and converting that over to urea, ammonia is a toxic substance. It's a neurotoxin, so that's just an endogenous production of that. And again, what is that? That's just secondary to protein metabolism. So, we tell people, hey, eat your protein, but you got to metabolize that, right? And then your gastrointestinal tract, obvious ones here with your feces and then carbon dioxide from the lungs. So let's look at some of the effects of these toxins, because sometimes we'll tell folks, you need to detoxify. Why? Right? They want to know the why. So we got to be able to provide that for them. This is the why for us. So here's some of the effects of your toxins. You're going to get increases in inflammation. Well, let's just stop right there for a second. How many chronic disease states do not have inflammation at the base of them? None, right? They all do. So there's one thing that we should begin to think about as far as how to utilize detoxification and in what clinical scenarios to begin to focus on this. Progressive aging, that's an interesting, we'll tie in some telomere talk on that. And then your medication use and the challenges that these pose on some of your cytochrome pathways, that's going to be more your phase one. The old one that gets talked about here sometimes is grapefruit juice, and the effects that grapefruit juice can have on the metabolism and the speed of some of your different meds. But it's affecting those cytochrome pathways is what the impact there is. And then looking at impairment of physiologic function, and I think probably the biggest and most profound one here, and I'll kind of give you an example of the degree to which that is the immune system dysregulation, how these toxins can actually act as, and rightfully so, how they act as a foreign antigen, but the immune system targets that just like it should, but now it targets that and it says, well, wait a minute, I'm not really being able to differentiate between this toxin over here, which I should be dealing with, and this inherent tissue or endogenous tissue, which I should be leaving alone because it's self, right? It causes some disruption in the inability to differentiate there. So let's start with one that a lot of us in here probably talk about from time to time, which are going to be the heavy metals. This is more familiar to us, a little bit more common. But let me just kind of work through this, because there are a lot of key points in this study in just the very initial portion of this abstract here. So mercury has a high affinity for sulfhydryl groups, inactivating numerous enzymatic reactions, amino acids, and sulfur-containing antioxidants, N-acetylcysteine, lipoic acid, and glutathione. Okay, those of us in here that are doing micronutrient testing, we can test those three right there. So automatically when we see that we run these tests on the patients and we see that the patient's got low status on these, we should automatically begin to trigger off what's causing that. What's causing those levels to go down? Is it something like this? And then I think for, with our example here of mercury, the other one that would really clue you into that is if you got a low selenium status too. Then you really want to follow up on potentially something like this. But let's move forward here. With subsequent decreased oxidant defense and increased oxidative stress. So oxidative stress, inflammation, synonymous terms, right? Saying the same thing here. So we're automatically saying just that exposure of mercury and the effects that that's going to have on these sulfhydryl groups and reducing their antioxidant capacity is going to increase our inflammation level. Okay? And then mercury binds to these metallothionein and substitutes for zinc, copper, and other trace minerals. And that other trace minerals, you could throw selenium into that. And then, how much talk is there out there right now about mitochondrial dysfunction and energy production? I mean, if you look at one of the primary, it's almost like a game now for a new patient for me not to come in and not have fatigue in their list of complaints, because they all do, right? And we all inherently know that mitochondria are responsible for our energy production, and if you work through those energy production pathways, you just think, okay, I've got maybe glycolysis or lipolysis in here, and then I get into the Krebs cycle, and then I get into my last stage with my electron transport chain. And we all think about the nutrients that are tied into each one of those sections. We've seen those energy diagrams. But what we don't think about on this is the role that these heavy metals might be playing in disrupting those energy production cycles. So this is just another mechanism to think about, especially as it relates to mitochondrial dysfunction here. This specifically says it here, reduction in your ATP levels, your adenosine triphosphate. Depletion of glutathione, increased lipid peroxidation. Think about this, when we talk about those lipid assessments, and we're looking at especially with like the LPP, if you're looking at the lipid profile and then you work through that middle section on the test where you've got the inflammatory markers in there, if you're seeing that those inflammatory markers are increasing and you're seeing that they have an LDL, now you know that they're potentially have a higher risk for oxidizing that LDL, right? So now they're at a higher cardiovascular risk. These heavy metals could be potentially one cause for that increase in oxidation. That's the reason that we didn't know all the physiology behind it, but that's one of the reasons that things like intravenous chelation has been so effective over the years, especially for people with cardiovascular disease. Just going one step further here, I'll just kind of get into the latter part of this one. Summarizes recent findings in the metal-induced formation of free radicals and the role of, again, oxidative stress, inflammation, in the carcinogenicity and toxicity of metals. So these guys are nasty out there. They're pretty ugly little players in here. And you'll notice on this, they actually define quite a few of the different metals, the mercury, the cadmium, the nickel. So it doesn't have to be just mercury in this. Arsenic. Now this is a schematic giving you an idea of when you're really talking about this, what it is that you're actually talking about. This is a glutathione molecule, and these are the sulfhydryl groups in here. You guys remember back into chemistry and biochemistry when they talk about the folding of the proteins back on themselves. This is one of the examples of how these proteins fold back on themselves and start forming longer chains, type things like that. But it's really these sulfhydryl groups in here are what get bound up by the heavy metals. These sulfhydryl groups have an affinity for heavy metals, which that's an ideal thing, especially when you're talking about getting into chelation and binding them up, trying to remove them out of the body. But you also want these sulfhydryl groups available to handle other oxidants in the body. I mean, just look at it from the standpoint of oxygen consumption. Just the sheer nature of breathing is creating free radicals in the body, right? I always laughingly joke with my patients sometimes, if you could stop breathing, I could stop you aging. But you can't, right? So. All right, we said we'd get into some telomeres here. You guys are familiar with telomeres, looking at the chromosomes and the very tips on these chromosomes, and the shorter those get, the older you're getting biologically, and you can compare that to your chronological age. So I just wanted to give you some examples of different toxins in here, all of which are going to affect the telomeres in the aging process. So in this first one, looking at DNA damage from cigarette smoke, okay? So an environmental exposure here. And then high lead exposure affecting telomere length. So, you know, I'm by no means an expert in where these metals come from, but I know that lead is pretty ubiquitous in our environment, even though we've taken it out of, you know, like paints and things like that. So it's still pretty prevalently found. And then this one, actually looking at it from a medication perspective. Now granted, we're talking chemotherapy here, so you're hitting a pretty hard medication class, but if you just think about, you know, some of the patients that walk in our clinic sometimes and you're looking at medication usage over time, those groups of patients may still be at risk here because they ultimately have to take those medications through the detoxification process. Remember, anything that is not inherent to the body, your body's going to perceive that as a toxin. It's going to perceive that it has to figure out a way to manipulate that to get it into a form that it can then excrete it out of your body. Otherwise, if it can't figure out how to insert it into a pathway somewhere, it's going to figure out a way to get it out. Okay? That's why we have so many excretory systems. I guess I never thought about that. You have really one route in and 5 ways out, right? So, kind of telling. This is actually looking at the connection into your thyroid, or not thyroid disease, but your autoimmunity here. We just use thyroid as the example indeed. And I do this because, I chose these because thyroid is the autoimmune example that's just so notorious out there. And there's really no rhyme or reason in terms of what you're going to see on the labs. I mean, a lot of times when I look at that, I'll look at the TSH is starting to creep up above 3 or towards 3. Sometimes I'll run those antibodies if the patient is suggesting some potential thyroid type symptoms, and a lot of times they'll show up, but it doesn't have to get there for them to show up. They can have them with normal thyroid markers. But look at where this is coming from. So your environmental exposures ranging from the byproducts of polychlorinated biphenyls from rocket fuel. We don't have any rockets going on around here, but still our environment is saturated with these things. Although most of these agents are associated with reduced thyroid hormone levels and impaired thyroid hormone action, a number of environmental exposures confer increased risk of autoimmune. So it doesn't just have to be the PCBs, it can be any number of these. And it really, it's not, I think about autoimmune conditions as being the perfect storm. You've got to have a couple of things that all come together. I mean, you've got to have generally a lower immune response. You've got to have an antigen coming in. You've generally got to have some dysregulation from the immune system because of lack of antioxidant status or omegas or your Ds, somewhere in that. And that all has to really fit together, and then that's when you manifest that autoimmunity. Here's one more example. And some of you may be familiar with this NHANES study. This is actually a pretty big study. So the fact that this information is coming out of that study is fairly relevant. But look at this. Women are at increased risk for autoimmune disorders. Mercury exposure has been associated with cellular autoimmunity, and mercury accumulates in the thyroid gland. So let's take that just even one step further, looking at the accumulation of mercury in the thyroid gland, and then also the effects of, if you look at the thyroid hormone pathways, where you're actually going from your thyroxine down into your T3, that conversion is a selenium-dependent conversion. So potentially your mercury could then even go and knock out that selenium-dependent enzyme as well. But this is actually looking at thyroglobulin autoantibody positivity. Part of the reason I wanted to include this last statement in here as well is because a lot of times when you look at the autoimmune aspects of thyroid, the one autoimmune marker that gets tested is your thyroid peroxidase. You really want to look at both of these. You don't want to look at just one or the other. You want to see both of them because they're really looking at two different aspects of thyroid physiology here. This is a pretty interesting study because it's looking at the different environmental estrogens, and we kind of use that term generically, and we might think about, at least in my mind, I think, estrogens, I think female physiology, and I think, well, maybe some plastics. We know some issues with plastics mimicking estrogens, but there's a lot of other ones here, and we'll talk about these. The prevalence of autoimmune diseases has significantly increased over the recent year. That one statement right there, that is a profound comment, and it really begs the question of why are these autoimmune conditions on such a rise right now? There's got to be something. There's something different in our environment than there was, say, let's just use a decade ago, that is triggering all these autoimmune conditions. I'll just give you an example. I think this was maybe like 2 or 3 Mondays ago. I had 3 new patients come in that day, and all 3 of them had autoimmune thyroid condition. You look like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. How do all 3 of these patients coming in all have autoimmune thyroid conditions? But if you look at where some of these estrogens are coming from, your phytoestrogens, sometimes we're looking at utilizing these from a therapeutic standpoint as biologically active compounds out of some of our botanicals that we recommend. Things like Vitex, black cohosh, those are the types of things you're talking about there. But then your mycoestrogens, these are byproducts that are secondary to fungal growths. So, if we're looking at, let's say we run a Metametrics GI effects test, and we're looking at the different species that we find in those stool samples, and we pick up a bacteria, fungus, and let's say there's no parasite in there. Well, we eradicate that, but the effects that the immune system has on the toxins that are produced by that fungal species are another line of thought that we need to think about in how this patient's immune system might be suppressed. It might not just be the absolute presence of that infection, it may now be the effect that the immune system is having in response to those different estrogens. Your xenoestrogens, those are going to be the ones that the plastics fall under, some of those ones that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then your different metals here, and then your medicinal estrogens. These are, if a lot of us are in this room are pretty versed on hormonal manipulation, but you do get some examples where an individual might get prescribed a higher level of estrogen, and they're just excreting excessive amounts of estrogen. That ends up over time in our water supply, and it's a potential for us to pick that back up. And then just looking at the individual that's receiving the prescription themselves, they've got to detox that, just like they do every hormone. If you're increasing the estrogen or progesterone or whatever the hormone, you're putting increased demand on those detoxification systems. This is something else. I'll just kind of scoot back over to the other side of this. Environmental estrogens, compounds that display estrogen-like activity, are ubiquitously present in the environment. So they're saturating us out there. One of the things that I wanted to mention in looking at this, I tried to keep everything that all the studies that I put up here of a human nature, but if you go through PubMed and start looking at these things, you'll get a lot of rat studies that pop up, you'll get a lot of fish studies that pop up, and even some of the livestock stuff comes up. And if you look at the changes that are happening to those species secondary to these effects, it's unbelievable the information that they're finding out there right now. I even saw some stuff where they're seeing the male species starting to have female characteristics, like completely changing the active behavior of these species, the genitalia on these species. It's scary, yeah. It's Frankenstein type stuff. Now, this is the catch term right here. If you're looking for information in the literature where they talk about really the end effect of what these hormones or not the hormones, what these toxins are doing, it's toxin-induced loss of tolerance. So it's the ability of your immune system to, again, recognize self versus non-self, and the trigger that causes the immune system not to continue to recognize self is this toxin-induced. So let's just kind of go to our last statement here. As usually has, I thought this was kind of interesting. And I thought this was interesting because I thought, okay, let me think about the group that I'm going to be talking to. We all try to be pretty progressive in our thought. We try to be, you're obviously here because you're trying to be cutting edge, right? You want to hear something new. Look at this. As has usually been the case throughout medical history, whenever new evidence regarding disease mechanisms emerges, resistance to the translation of knowledge abounds. So let's just go with our topic right now. If we mention detoxification to someone who's not more functionally minded, we kind of get that, we get the glass eyes look, right? They just shut down on us. They don't really want to hear anymore. But look at how much information, I haven't even gotten into the physiology with you yet. Look at how much information there is about the effects of toxins on our body. You've obviously got to have a way to deal with this stuff, right? Or we'd all just be falling over, from toxin exposure or acute toxin exposure. So this is really, this toxin-induced loss of tolerance, that's the catch term if you guys want to follow up on that. So let's look at the physiology behind this. I posed the question to you, should we rename detoxification? And I think, I'm going to vote on the side of yes, we probably actually should. Because one, of all the negative and probably unfairly given negative connotations to detoxification, but two, I don't really think detoxification explains really what it is. Biotransformation to me is a much better term. It actually tells you that within the biological systems, you're trying to transform a substance into a state where you can excrete it out of the body. And if you just want to look at this from a more simplistic viewpoint, if you look at when things are coming into phase 1, it's going to be of a fat-soluble nature. Then it goes into these intermediate steps, and that's where you're going to have more of a reactive substance, but then it should immediately scoot into phase 2, and once things are in phase 2, you're going to finalize that conversion over into a water-soluble substance, right? And then you can excrete it out. Obviously, you're not going to urinate out fats, right? You can urinate out a water-soluble substance. So just kind of think about it from that perspective. That's really the end game right there. So let's go into a little bit more detail on this process, because again, we've got 3 phases here. If you look at phase 1, you're really, again, looking at these cytochrome P450 enzymes. That's what you're talking about. And these are iron-dependent enzymes. So if you go back and you think about some of our previous conversations where we've talked about the anemias, the various types of anemias that are out there, when you're initially making that assessment on the patient, you want to make sure that you're getting that blood count in there. I mean, it's the most simple, most basic blood test, but it provides so much information for us. If you see that these patients, let's say they have a low hemoglobin and you're backtracking, you're thinking, okay, potentially low iron's tied into cytochrome P450, then this could be one of your mechanisms that it could be impairing. So initial phase 1. The other thing is that I think is really significant for you to grab hold on this concept is that in phase 1 detoxification is not a liver-dependent enzyme process. You have cytochrome P450 enzymes in your brain, and they're initiating that detoxification. Okay, so this is something that is all throughout the body. Again, where do you find, remember I mentioned the mitochondria. The mitochondria can be affected because of the effects of these toxins on the P450 enzymes in the mitochondria. Right? So they're throughout the entire body. And in your phase 2 is going to be conjugation. That's the lump term of ultimately what's happening there. And with that conjugation, you're finalizing that conversion over into that water-soluble substance. You guys remember back from chemistry, I mean, when the base, when you were first in like your Chem 1, and they were talking about water and looking at the polarity in water, this is ultimately, kind of the concept that we're looking at. You're trying to make these substances, these toxins, more polar so you can get them out. If they're polar, they're more easy to excrete. And again, phase 3 is kind of obvious to us, right? Your elimination methods. So let's back this up with a little bit of research in here. So what I wanted to show you here is, and let me show you something else real quick and this will make more sense to you. If you look at your phase 2 has 6 subsets You've got your sulfation, glucuronidation, glutathione, acetylation, amino acid conjugation, or conjugation, and methylation. We talked a lot about methylation last time, right? So we know the importance of B12 and folate there, but those are the 6 subsets of phase 2. So here's the reason I made mention of that. Look at the outcomes in this study. Reduced metabolism of, or reduced sulfation has been found with increased frequency in individuals with severe or with several degenerative neurological and immunological conditions and drug intolerances. Okay, but here's something else I wanted to put out. This last one, delayed food sensitivity. And I'm sure I would get some arguments on this from some other people out there. I'm sure I would, right? But I'm just quoting a study here, all right? That's all I'm doing. But how many of us do delayed food sensitivity testing? A lot of us in here do that, right? But this is actually saying that if you don't have adequate sulfation as part of your detoxification process, you may not be getting adequate information on your delayed food sensitivity testing. So I'm not jumping on either side of the fence with that. I'm just, again, reporting what the information says to you. You guys can make a decision about that, but it's an interesting food for thought. I actually, a couple of weekends ago, I heard another well-respected lecturer actually said the same thing. That was talking about sulfation. He actually said the same thing in regards to methylation. So I haven't dug in on any research on that, but maybe something to investigate. Xenobiotic metabolism in Parkinson's disease. And again, think about this, guys. This doesn't have to progress into Parkinson's disease. How many people that walk in the door and you ask them, how's your motivation? It's not that good. Well, that's affecting the dopamine system. So, Parkinson's, that's dopamine metabolism, right? These results suggest a deficiency in detoxification pathways involving sulfur. So again, your sulfation may be unusually susceptible to exogenous or even endogenous toxins. So it doesn't have to be something they're exposed to in their environment. And here's actually one that really just says exactly what we were talking about earlier, and he's very blunt about induction of allergic and autoimmune reactions by drugs and other chemicals constitutes a major public health problem, right? So, if you've got the public health world picking up on this stuff, then, clinical medicine tends to generally outpace public health type of medical approaches here. So is your patient toxic? So you just want a quick, easy way to identify this. How many of you have seen the questionnaires that some companies and things like that recommend? They're pretty lengthy, right? And some of them subniche them out into, say, like mercury toxicity or something of that nature. That's very cumbersome to me, right? There's got to be a shorter way to do that.
Yeah.
So here's my quick, easy way to do this, all right? So first thing I want to know, how many bowel movements do you have a day? And actually what I've started refining my question to be with this, because of the answers that I kept getting back, my question now is, do you have a bowel movement every day?
Yes.
Right? It's not how many, it's do you. And if they tell me no, then it's how many do you have in a week? So that's the first one, because if they're not having bowel movements, they're not excreting out the toxins. And if you're looking at you want to plant the seed with our patients, the goal is to get them to have initially a bowel movement every day, and then at least 2 to 3 bowel movements every day. Because ideally you should have one after every major meal. Right? Next, how much water do you drink on a daily basis? If our patients are dehydrated, they're probably not having adequate clearance through the kidney. So kind of easy one there. And then of course you want to think on the flip side of that and think about your diuretics. And do patients use medications, right? Because we know the effect. Think about it this way again. Think about the statement I made earlier. A medication, even though they're absolutely necessary in many cases, is still a foreign substance. It's still something that the body has to process and kind of work through. That's the reason if you look in a PDR, you get the pharmacodynamics, you get the pharmacokinetics. The body's got to figure out how to use that stuff and how to process it. So that's just adding to the work that the detox systems have to do. So we need to take that into consideration. What type of diet does the patient eat? If they're telling you they're vegetarian, all right, let's use an extreme example to paint the picture here. If they're telling you they're vegetarian, we know vegetarians probably are going to have some gaps in their essential amino acid intake, right? Remember, one of those subsets in phase 2 is amino acid conjugation. So potentially they have an impairment of phase 2 just based on the quantity of proteins that they're consuming in their diet, right? And again, I'm not advocating go be a carnivore here, all right? That's not my point, all right? And then if we look at carbohydrates, We know that increased or excess carbohydrate consumption is ultimately going to increase an inflammatory state because of a glucotoxic and an insulinotoxic state. You're causing those two chemicals to climb up in the body. They create inflammation. Inflammation down-regulates the activity of those detoxification pathways. That, and I'll show you a more specific example of this, but looking at your fruits and your vegetables both of those are really going to have higher fiber content, and they're also going to have those phytonutrients, and those phytonutrients are what are going to keep those intermediate, when you're going between phase 1 and phase 2, that's what's going to keep those under control so they're not causing a lot of problems. You ever hear anybody talk about having a detox reaction or having a negative reaction to a detox process, even if they've done more of a physiologic type detox process? Probably what they're doing is they're backing things up on in phase 1 because they can't keep getting cleared through phase 2. And you're increasing inflammation. Increases, as somebody who has a ton of inflammation, they don't feel very good, right? So that could be one of the mechanisms you're looking at there. And of course, most of us know about charred foods, and you're basically eating a carcinogen when you're eating that. Just real quick here again, your fiber is going to bind your toxins, promote routine bowel movements. Your fats have an inflammatory nature. Your protein supporting phase 2, and then let's look at all these several different nutrients here. This next slide, this is a little bit of detail for you, right? If you could summarize everything up that we're going to talk about today, it all falls into this one slide right here. So if you look at the different reactions and the different types of reactions, you've got your oxidation reduction. I mean, that's like, ooh, that's way back in Chem 1 right there, right? So, but there was a reason we learned that stuff in Chem 1, and this is where it all comes back to. But look at this. This is like the sales pitch of the year for why you should use micronutrient testing with detoxification, right? Look at that. B2, B3, B6, folic acid or folate, your cobalamin, glutathione. I mean, that's all stuff, for the most part, in the upper portion that's what you're going to see in the micronutrient test. And then, if you're looking at these reactive intermediates here, this is like your last row on the micronutrient test on the report, and then your second page. That's all your antioxidants right here, right? There's your spectrox at work, right? And then